There was no written order, no mission number, no report waiting to be filed. What we were about to do was never allowed to exist on paper, and if it went wrong, no one would ever admit we were there. Some missions begin with orders typed, signed, and archived. This one began with nothing written at all. The room was deliberately empty. No insignia, no flags, no digital screens. Just a table, a folded map, and a man who never introduced himself by rank or unit. His uniform was clean, unmarked, and intentionally forgettable. When he spoke, his voice was controlled and unemotional, as if rehearsed to remove personality from every word. This mission will not exist on paper. Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper understood the implication immediately. No operation number, no written tasking, no official authorization that could ever be referenced. If something went wrong, there would be no report to clarify intent, no documentation to justify actions taken in good faith. Everything that followed would live only in memory, and memory was not admissible evidence. Harper had served long enough to recognize the nature of the tasking. This was not secrecy for convenience or classification level. This was deliberate deniability, a mission designed to be erased the moment it ended, regardless of outcome. The man explained the parameters once, slowly, without repetition. Harper listened carefully. There would be no second briefing, no follow-up email. When this conversation ended, so did any official acknowledgement that it had ever happened. The cost of the mission became clear before the objective ever did. Harper was told explicitly that there would be no record of personnel movement, no operational log, no casualty reporting tied to this tasking. If a man was injured, treatment would be handled discreetly and off the books. If someone did not come back, there would be no notification tied to this mission, only a gap that would need to be explained later through other means. This was not an oversight. It was intentional. The man emphasized that this operation existed outside normal command structures. Official channels were too slow. Political sensitivities too complex. Plausible deniability was not a fallback. It was the mission's primary protection. Harper felt the weight of it settle in. Silence was no longer just a tactical choice. It was a condition of participation. To accept the mission meant accepting that no one outside the team would ever know what risks had been taken or why. There would be no recognition, no citation, no acknowledgement. Only responsibility. The team was assembled quietly, without formal orders or unit designation. No roster was created, no mission packet distributed. Each man was selected individually, based on reliability rather than rank or specialization. They did not ask why they were chosen. Soldiers with experience understood what silence meant in this context. Questions invited details. Details created records. Records were liabilities. Harper looked at the men as they prepared. Movements were efficient, restrained, professional. Weapons checked, comms tested, then powered down. There was no casual conversation, no dark humor to relieve tension. Everyone understood that this mission was not meant to be remembered. They were not a unit for this operation. They were an element, temporary, unacknowledged, and disposable if necessary. The absence of ceremony made the reality clearer than any speech could have. They moved at night, along routes deliberately excluded from standard patrol maps. No GPS tracking, no air cover, no external overwatch. Their presence was meant to leave no footprint, physical or digital. Harper was acutely aware of how exposed they were. Without official acknowledgement, there would be no quick reaction force if they were compromised. No medevac on standby, no escalation ladder to climb. Operating without trace offered freedom of movement, but stripped away every safety net normally built into military operations. Every decision would need to be self-contained, every mistake permanent. This was the trade-off. The intelligence driving the mission was fragmented and time-sensitive. A high-value individual was believed to be transiting the area, exploiting gaps between jurisdictions and oversight. There was no confirmation he was still there. No ISR feed, no real-time updates, only probability. Harper understood this was where deniable missions became dangerous. When certainty disappeared, discipline had to replace it. Acting on assumptions could trigger consequences that could never be corrected or explained. They held position, observing quietly. Minutes stretched into something heavier. Time was no longer neutral. Every passing second increased exposure while offering nothing in return. The rules of engagement still applied, but without institutional cover. Any use of force would be judged later without context, without a written justification, without command endorsement. The men would carry the full legal and moral weight individually. Harper understood the paradox. He was expected to act decisively, yet bear sole responsibility for outcomes that normally belong to a chain of command. Leadership in this environment meant absorbing risk that could not be shared. Movement appeared near the objective area. A vehicle, lights off, moving deliberately. Too controlled to ignore. Too ambiguous to engage. Harper raised his hand. The team froze. Optics scanned darkness that refused to give answers. This was the moment unofficial missions were built around. The moment where action had to be taken without confirmation, backup, or record. Whatever decision was made here would never exist outside the men present. Harper chose restraint. They observed longer, collecting fragments instead of conclusions. No escalation, no confrontation. The risk of irreversible consequences outweighed the incomplete picture. The vehicle eventually moved on. No shots fired, no contact made, no confirmation achieved. Some would call it failure, others would call it discipline. Harper understood that success, in this context, was defined by what did not happen. They exfiltrated the same way they arrived, quietly, anonymously. No debriefing room, no formal end state. The man from the briefing did not reappear. No one asked for a report. The mission ended by disappearing. Harper felt an unfamiliar emptiness. Soldiers were trained to measure success through objectives achieved. This mission offered none of that, only silence. Days passed. Routine operations resumed. Missions existed on paper again. But the Deniable mission remained with Harper, not because of what happened, but because of what could never be said. There would be no closure, no acknowledgement that the risk had even been taken. Harper realized that some missions were designed not just to avoid documentation, but to ensure accountability remained entirely personal. In most operations, the debrief is where events are ordered, lessons extracted, and responsibility distributed across a structure larger than any one individual. This mission had no such ending. There was no room, no timeline review, no after-action report. No one asked Harper what he had seen, what decisions he had weighed, or what risks had been absorbed quietly in the dark. The absence of a debrief was not an oversight. It was deliberate. Acknowledgement would have created record. Record would have created exposure. Silence was safer, but silence had consequences. Without a formal conclusion, the mission remained unfinished in Harper's mind. There was no authoritative voice to say the call had been right or wrong. No institutional validation that restraint had been the correct course. The decision simply existed, unresolved, carried forward without resolution. Harper realized that without debrief, memory became the only archive. And memory, unlike paper, did not stay still. It replayed moments differently with time, introducing doubt where none had existed in the moment. Recognition was never expected, but its absence still carried weight. Harper returned to routine duties where performance was measured, documented, and reviewed. Patrols were logged. Decisions were evaluated. Commanders spoke of accountability and transparency. Yet the most consequential mission of his deployment existed outside that system entirely. He noticed a subtle shift in how he perceived his service. Not bitterness, something quieter. A growing awareness that some sacrifices were designed to remain invisible. That professionalism sometimes meant accepting that effort would never be acknowledged, not because it lacked value, but because acknowledging it would defeat its purpose. This understanding isolated him, not from his fellow soldiers, but from the narrative of service itself. The story others could tell about their deployments would never include his most defining night. Time did not clarify the mission. It complicated it. Harper found himself replaying the decision points, not out of guilt, but out of unresolved responsibility. With no external assessment, every outcome remained hypothetical. Had restraint prevented escalation, or had it allowed a threat to persist? There was no data to answer either question. This ambiguity began to erode certainty in subtle ways. Harper became more deliberate, more cautious, not hesitant, but aware that some decisions never received confirmation, only consequence. He understood then that uncertainty was not a temporary condition of deniable missions. It was a permanent feature. In subsequent operations, Harper carried the memory of operating without institutional cover. He noticed how different leadership felt when documentation existed, when orders were written, when decisions were shared across a command structure. That night had stripped leadership down to its most exposed form. No buffer, no shield, just judgment. Harper recognized that while doctrine emphasized shared responsibility, reality sometimes demanded solitary accountability. That experience reshaped how he viewed command, not as authority, but as ownership. Leadership, he concluded, was not about control over outcomes. It was about willingness to carry decisions that no one else could absorb. The men from the team never spoke about the mission, not because they were ordered not to, but because there was no framework to discuss it. Shared experience usually created cohesion. This one created silence. Each man carried his own version of events, untested against others' perspectives. Without discussion, memory hardened into something personal and immovable. Harper sensed that the mission had affected them differently. Some appeared unaffected. Others grew quieter. None sought acknowledgement. The mission had bonded them through absence rather than action. Harper began to understand the true cost of deniable operations. It was not measured in risk or danger, but in ownership. By design, deniability transferred accountability downward, away from institutions, away from policy, onto individuals. The mission had succeeded in its strategic purpose, whatever that purpose truly was. But it had done so by placing moral and psychological burdens squarely on those who could never speak of it. That cost would never appear in metrics. Official history would continue without reference to that night. Analysts would debate patterns using incomplete data. Commanders would plan future operations based on records that excluded entire categories of action. Harper understood now that history was not incomplete by accident. It was curated. The mission's absence was intentional, not because it lacked importance, but because its importance demanded invisibility. Over time, Harper stopped seeking resolution, not because questions were answered, but because he accepted that some would never be. He learned to live with the silence without resenting it, to understand that professionalism sometimes required carrying weight alone, without validation or closure. This acceptance did not diminish the mission, it defined it. Years later, Harper would struggle to explain his service in simple terms. He would speak in generalities, avoid specifics, not out of secrecy, but because precision would imply records that did not exist. The mission lived on only in how it had shaped him, in restraint, in judgment, in an understanding of leadership that no manual could teach. Some missions are never written down because they are not meant to be shared. They exist to prevent outcomes rather than create them, to stop events that history will never know almost happened. Harper accepted that truth without regret. The mission had never existed on paper, but it had existed where it mattered most, in decision, in restraint, in responsibility.